right, we're here with Naveed Jamali, who's running for Seattle City Council, District Number 7. Would you like to take a 2-minute introduction?
Sure. I'll just give you a quick overview of who I am. Maybe that's a good place to start. Naveed Jamali, and as the joke goes, I cannot trace my lineage back to the Mayflower. I'm not an original Seattleite. In fact, I am a transplant. My wife and my 2 sons came here about 3 years ago to New York City. She came here because she's a geneticist, works with Fred Hutch, and we came here like many over the last decade for opportunity. After living here for 3 years, I really want this to be a place that we can grow into, we can establish roots, and no better way to do that than roll up our sleeves and actually put that sweat equity into it. My background is a little bit eclectic. 3 years counterintelligence against the Russians, or National Intelligence Medal by Bob Mueller. I've been given 10 years in the Navy as an intelligence officer, 2 years with MSNBC as an intelligence analyst. I've done a lot. I'm proud to be non-traditional. I'm proud to work on non-traditional problems and to bring a non-traditional approach to solving them. I've done everything from support Navy doctors in Afghanistan, getting them medical textbooks. So I enjoy problems, and I think that what Seattle needs, quite candidly, is an approach that is neither left nor right, but more of a centrist, practical, thoughtful, transparent, inclusive way of solving things. I'm proud that very much of my effort has been writing policy, and I brought some examples with me today, including focusing on things a lot of people aren't. Of course, we're going to talk about homelessness, I'm sure. One of the big things I'm very proud of is proposal for the Office of Procedural Justice to reform the way we handle prosecution and reporting of sexual assault and rape. So these are things that, again, they may be non-traditional, but I think that there's room here in this city for opportunity and for a different way to look at things and to actually be progressive. So that's very much my focus.
Great. And we are on Clayton, so if you would like to go ahead and you can flip over that piece of paper now.
If elected, what policies will you support to address the need for affordable housing and homeless services?
Yeah, so this is, I think when it comes to homelessness, and I've spent time doing outreach with MID, I've spent time with the navigation teams at Kinnear Park, been there repeatedly when they've gone through the park. Look, it is a difficult problem, but I am very much one of the mind that everyone's going to come here and say we need permanent supportive housing, and I agree, we do. There's not a question that services need to be improved, but what I've found is that in many cases, the first and second contact comes with, unfortunately, the police, and the second one comes with the court. When we're dealing with the city attorney's office, this is not about ideology, it's not about the city attorney himself. The reality is there are 31 city attorneys, there's 16 prosecutors. When we talk about diversion, which is a program I feel very strongly for, the question of actually getting someone to a diversion program won't get brought up until a prosecutor actually brings someone to charge someone. And what we've seen with repeat offenders is the threshold is very, very high for that. So I want to build permanent supportive housing, I want housing, but I also want to acknowledge that we need to build both tiers of this for this to be successful.
Okay. And Sherry?
Seattle has the most regressive tax code in a state with the most regressive tax code in the country. Given the repeal of the head tax and the ongoing litigation over the city income tax, how would you raise more progressive revenue to help fund city services?
Yeah. So I think very much, again, when I think about the city of Seattle, one of the things, both my kids go to public school. One of the reasons we moved to Seattle, I make no bones about it, we were paying $80,000 a year for private school in New York City. We couldn't afford it. We're very much fans of public school, and look, every day I come across a city service that I feel is underfunded. I met this wonderful Seattle City Park Ranger. There are 2 of them. That's down from 9. This is a great program. I don't understand why it's not funded, but the question is revenue. Now, do we actually increase? Do we look at levies? Do we look at existing funding streams? These are all good questions, but I think that the reality is that we need to take different approaches to how we're going to address this. The head tax, I've spoken very directly with companies like Expedia, companies like Amazon. I think that they can be partners in this. It's not about, look, they're here simply because there's talent. That talent has to be able to afford to live here. If that talent, my wife, perfect example, we can afford to live here. If someone who works from Amazon can afford to live here, they're going to leave. And if they leave, then Amazon, that's a loss to Amazon. So there is a room there to negotiate. I think that the ask and the way that we approach this has to be exactly that, a negotiation. I think the concept of a head tax, the term may be dead, but I do believe that we can go back to this well. We just have to ask it the right way. There has to be an ROI for them, and the ROI for Amazon and Expedia and all these big companies is that if we can show that the money is going to benefit retention, they're on board.
Okay, thank you. Brittany?
Okay. Given the city's reset of remove Seattle levy, the upcoming expiration of the city's bus funding tax, and the planning for light rail for much of our districts, what will be your priorities in deciding how the city spends its transportation?
Yeah, this is a great question. Look, I think you're not going to get anyone who's going to disagree that mass transit is the future and the direction we need to move in. I've actually written policy. The first policy we wrote was focused on transportation. And what I wanted to focus on was what do we do in those interim years? Before, was it 2035 when the last connector is supposed to go into place? I mean, this is a long-term project, and these are numbers that very well can move left or right depending on God knows what. But in the interim, what can we do? And I think that mass transit is the solution, but we have a heck of a lot of Seattleites that live very far from repeat sort of access to mass transit, 15 minutes or more. A third of Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. And look, we are someone who lives on 10th Avenue. My wife works at the Fred Hutch. There's not an easy mass transit solution for her to get there. So what do we do in the interim years? What do we do while we start moving towards mass transit? And one of the things that we focused on is looking at Mercer. So we came up with a simple plan to say, okay, we know that traffic is repeatable. We know that from 8 to 10, traffic is at choke points. We know from 4 to 6, traffic is at choke points. We looked at 8 other major cities, and what do? They take traffic and parking enforcement officers, and during those times of the day, they make them traffic enforcement officers. Does it solve mass transit? No. Does it make it safer for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists? Yes. We're sharing a space that's not going to go away for a number of years. This is something that, with a stroke of a pen, because right now the police department is the only one that can override traffic control devices, we can actually make traffic enforcement officers out of parking enforcement officers and actually have an impact on transportation in the city. And I say that because my priority is still mass transit, but we need to have an impact today, and these are low-hanging fruits that I think we can accomplish with little effort and little cost.
Robert.
All right, lastly, prepared questions. How will you continue the process of reforming the Seattle Police Department beyond the upcoming expiration of the consent decree?
So, I spent a lot of time with SPOG, I spent a lot of time with the fire department. I think that my focus is not going to be necessarily completely on, I think we need to move away from this concept of reform. And I'm saying this as a person of color. I'm saying this as someone who's, very well faced head-on bigotry and racism. My father, one of his first jobs when he came to the United States, he's an immigrant, he was a PhD in philosophy, was actually teaching ethics at the NYPD in the 70s, and he can tell you some stories. I think that what we need to focus on now is not about criminalization, but the simple concept of enforcement in terms of patrol. Look, I went to the North Precinct, and one of the things that I saw is it's 30 square, they have 6 squads, and it's basically that they're patrolling 5 square miles each. The reality is that with the manning that they have, and they're constantly responding to 911 calls, that patrol isn't happening. And I do believe that there is a benefit, not about arrests, not about criminalization, but there's a benefit to having community policing. And I think that the numbers that we have, the fact that there are police officers in single cars, the fact that we have 1,300 police officers, which is up from 1,100 from the 70s, and we have to understand that the number of patrol officers has stayed flat or even declined, that is a major problem. So when I think about use of force, when I think about community policing, I want to have more police in the community. I want to see an increase in manpower. I want to see us in line with cities like San Francisco and Boston. And I think that if we have more police, if we're doing things like recruiting from the community, I want to offer points if someone takes courses here at some of the universities on the police exam, which we can do. I want to encourage very much to recruit from the community. I want to encourage a more diverse force, and I want to encourage us to try to grow this. And I think that is where the focus should be, not about focusing on consent decree, but rather on policing and community policing.
And we are follow-ups, which are 1 minute responses each. And Alice? And then Ben.
What are your thoughts on kind of missing middle housing, and then as a corollary to that, sort of your thoughts on single-family zoning
Yeah.
and our approach to that?
So, missing middle. We're that in density, right? So we moved here, we sold our apartment, we rent, we live, we were able to find a 3-bedroom apartment. Look, one of the challenges is I'm very much pro-density. It's the future. Again, just like mass transit, we know this is the way it's going to go. There's a couple of issues. One is there are quite a few independent single-unit landlords, and many of those smaller abodes. I live in one of those sort of 3-story privately owned building. In many cases, they're below market value. The problem is that in order for the owner to expand, it's a significant cost, and many of them are at this precipice where they don't want to make the investment in that. So how do we encourage that source of housing? How do we encourage developers to build 2 and 3 bedroom housing for families? Because that's what, frankly, candidly, I need. I think that a lot of this is going to have to be creative in the fact that many developers start with a huge cost to build this out. If we can reduce that cost, we can perhaps encourage them to build affordable family housing.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Ben?
Can you tell me how many homeless folks are living in King County right now?
Oh, I don't know. What is it, 14? I don't know what the last one night count was. I don't know offhand.
Of that number, do you know what percentage were living or working in King County before they became homeless?
I don't.
Do you think it's important for someone in the city council to know these numbers?
I mean, we can go into specifics and we can play stump to chump, but the reality is policy. It's a problem. I can also tell you that I spent a lot of time with different types of homeless. I would put them into 3 buckets, and the thing that I've actually spoken out quite a bit is when we talk about, when you ask someone in the district what they mean by homeless, most of them are talking about people living in RVs and tents. And the thing that frustrates me, I spent a lot of time with the Muslim Housing Association Society, is there's a lot of invisible homeless people who are much more in need and missing, and we don't see that. So the focus becomes on this minority, and it takes the oxygen out of the room for the larger. And I think, look, people like a woman who's escaped a domestic violence situation, and the husband is the breadwinner, and now she finds herself with her kids without being able to make rent. I mean, these are things that I think most people would agree we should be helping with. There's, again, low-hanging fruit. But it's not someone living in a tent, so we ignore it. And I think that's part of the challenge with this, as opposed to the numbers.
Thank you.
Robert?
So I've talked with officers and commanders, I know you as well, and a lot of them feel like they're stretched in different directions. Like they're asked to be basically frontline social workers, and they're asked to be, on patrol looking out for actual genuine crime. Is there a way that we can, ramp up the services that are provided to people in a way that frees up a lot of that capacity, even among our existing force, given how hard it is to ramp up hiring in the short term, so that cops aren't the ones who are the first responders to someone in crisis, but that we can find resources and funding to help protect our workers.
So I spent time with this wonderful Seattle City Park Ranger, and it's a great program. They're not peace officers. They don't have the power to arrest, but they're the ones who actually patrol. They're the ones who could develop relationships with occupants of parks. And look, I mean, I think that is a program we should be investing in. We should be building that out. It's much easier to hire someone, these are in many cases retired correction officers, they're on a second career. It's clearly much less expensive, much quicker to train them to do things like that. So if we have them, and look, when I've been to all these sweeps, in many cases the park rangers are the one leading this, or the park ranger, I should say. So that's, again, low-hanging fruit. The other part I would put in is that it's not just about police. Again, I get back to the city attorney's office. 31 city attorneys, 16 prosecutors. The reality is that, I kind of don't want to side too much with the police on this, but there is a justification, and again, it's not about the city prosecutors, but there is a reality. With 16 prosecutors, they just cannot take on, there's only so much they can take on.
Sarah was next.
Are you in favor of impact fees? And if so, would you work to get them implemented in the Seattle City Council?
So you're talking about can you give an example?
Like a one-time fee on new development.
So this goes back to the question of talking to developers. I don't want to be terribly pro-developer here, but there's a reality. When a lot of the developers are done, they're starting with a fairly big nut. That means they're taking on not an insignificant amount of debt, And I think that unfortunately is going to set the price for the market. So we've seen things where there is exemption for 4 units, and some of the zoning is for 3 units. They can't qualify for that property exemption. I think that there's got to be ways that we look at incentivizing, again, to the missing middle, how we build family housing. Because we look at the villages, it seems like 75 to 80% of the housing in urban villages is either studio or 1 bedroom. I mean, this is something that we need to get out of. And again, capitalism is there, but there is a problem that the cost for them to do this is not insignificant. So how do we reduce that? How do we incentivize it? How do we also keep existing housing so they can expand and not be sold?
Lauren?
So, District 7, a big chunk of it is Magnolia. And as you know, there's a lot of proposals flying around for what to do about Magnolia Bridge. Have you looked at those proposals, and what is your thinking?
Yeah, so I've talked about this, and I think that this is, I'm very much a negotiator, and I'm totally against Trump. I hate to see him put us in the same sentence, but again, I think that this was a missed opportunity. We had Expedia. This was the time to go forward with that. The reality is a $400 million price tag, right? I mean, whatever which way we slice it, I'm not going to blow smoke up anywhere here. It's just, this is a cost. So who is going to foot the bill? And I think that that's a significant cost for the city. It's not that I don't believe the bridge should be replaced, but I think that we have to look outside of the city to do this. It should be, Magnolia is, it's certainly an island, but we don't want to make it so. And people use it, but again, $400 million, that's a fairly hefty price tag. The joke we have in our campaign is everyone's going to say they support the Magnolia Bridge, but I don't know if that means they're going to physically hold it up. I support a 1-to-1 replacement, but I would be very hard pressed to say that the city should be footing this bill solely.
Summer?
When you were asked about homelessness, you said that there were 3 buckets of homelessness, and I just wondered if you could expand on
Sure.
that and what those 3 buckets are.
So I sort of, I went down to Night Watch, and I was talking to the folks there, and I sort of see homelessness, and I've been very open about trauma. I suffer from PTSD. I fully admit that someone living who's homeless, that is traumatic in of itself. And I think that there's a reality. The longer someone is in that situation, the longer the trauma occurs, and the more difficult it is to help them. And it bothers me immensely. And so when I say the 3 buckets, I sort of say that there is the first tranche, which is almost this sort of temporary homeless. It's someone who's lost their job, who's, again, the example of the woman, they're more easy to address. They're not the ones we see. Then there's the second, which is someone who's been there 6 months or more. And then there's the third, which is really chronic. We're talking about a decade or so with mental illness. And I say that because there is no one-size-fits-all for all 3. We have to address that as such, which is why the term homelessness sometimes frustrates me. I think it minimizes the complexity of it.
I wanted to follow up on a couple questions here. You've come in with more written policies than a lot of the other candidates. That being said, and I'm not trying to play stuff the chump, but you didn't know the homelessness numbers, you weren't familiar with impact fees. So seeing as that there are policies out there and proposals out there, what kind of research have you done to see what's already out there, what's being proposed in this data? Or have you, just been crafting your policies based on what you see?
No. So look, a lot of my campaign is meant to be grassroots. We work with volunteers. I do not have a paid campaign manager or a consultant. I'm very proud of that. So much of it, like when we wrote about the Office of Procedural Justice, we talked to KSARC, we talked to Leah Griffin, Tina Orwell. I mean, these are a lot of this is, I remember talking to the Sierra Club, and we were talking about LID and zoning, and one of the suggestions that came out said, hey, what about a proposal that requires buildings to be pre-wired for solar panels? Even if solar panels are too expensive today, the per unit cost for the next decade or 2 will make it affordable. So why not require pre-wiring today when it's cheaper to put the wiring in the building? These are things that I've learned not because I'm some Swami genius, but because people tell them to me. So much of this, look, I don't claim to be an expert in anything, but the Navy taught me as an intelligence officer to learn quickly. And a lot of that is based on talking to people and quite candidly listening. So a lot of these proposals, yes, they are my idea, but a lot of it is individual parts that we've heard from other people and work with them.
And I think that was our final question, if you would like to take about 30 seconds to wrap up.
Sorry, how much time?
30 seconds?
Oh, only 30 seconds. So much time, what could I possibly say? So, very much my focus, again, is on policy. I'm doing this because I think this is a time for new ideas. I think we see with the Democratic Party, and I'm excited to bring that to Seattle. I think Seattle is very much I fully reject the idea that Seattle is dying. If it was, we wouldn't be here. I'm excited to bring change. I'm excited to try something different. And you know what? It doesn't have to be the third or fourth or fifth generation Seattleite. Like, there's a whole influx of people, and we have just as much of a right to call this a city as anyone else. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.